My daughter-in-law Bree showed up at my front door with a clipboard and a phony smile, claiming my house was condemned and I had 24 hours to pack. I knew something stank worse than week-old fish. "Walter, the city inspector found major structural damage," she announced, waving official-looking papers in my face. "You could die if you stay here another night." What she didn't know was that after 35 years delivering mail in Cedar Falls, I knew every inspector, contractor, and city official in town. And the name on her papers belonged to a man who'd been dead for 6 months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Oak Ridge Drive as I sat in my kitchen, nursing my second cup of black coffee and reading the Cedar Falls Gazette. 2 years had passed since Rose left this world, and the silence in our colonial house still caught me off guard sometimes. The sports section crinkled as I turned the page, the familiar sound echoing through rooms that had once buzzed with family dinners and grandchildren's laughter. My son David's voice drifted from the living room, where he'd been pacing for the better part of an hour, talking in hushed tones on his cell phone. His wife Bree had requested this Sunday morning visit, something about family matters that needed immediate discussion. At 74, I'd learned that immediate family discussions rarely brought good news. "Dad, can you come in here?" David called, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard since he was a teenager trying to explain a dented car bumper. I folded the newspaper and made my way to the living room, where Bree stood beside the mantelpiece, her manicured fingers drumming against Rose's favorite vase. She wore the kind of smile that reminded me of insurance salesmen and politicians, all surface charm hiding deeper calculations. "Walter, David and I have been talking," she began, her voice saccharine sweet. "We're concerned about you living alone in this big house. It's just not practical anymore." I settled into my recliner, the same spot where I'd watched countless football games with David and helped my grandchildren with homework before they moved to Portland with David's ex-wife. "I'm managing just fine, Bree. House is paid off, utilities are current, and Ernie next door checks on me regularly." David shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. "Dad, it's not about managing. It's about what makes sense for everyone involved." Everyone involved. That phrase sent warning bells clanging in my head like a fire truck racing down Main Street. In 35 years of postal work, I'd learned to read people as clearly as addresses on envelopes. Bree's tight smile and David's nervous fidgeting spelled trouble in capital letters. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the suspicion growing in my gut. Bree moved closer, perching on the edge of Rose's old sewing chair like a bird of prey eyeing its next meal. "Sunset Village has some lovely assisted living options. Clean, safe, with people your own age and medical care right on site." Assisted living. The euphemism hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I'd visited Sunset Village exactly once when my neighbor Frank Morrison's family moved him there against his wishes. The place smelled like disinfectant and defeat, filled with people who'd given up their independence for the illusion of security. "I don't need assisted living," I stated firmly. "I drive myself to the grocery store, maintain this house, and volunteer at the food bank twice a week. My doctor says I'm in better shape than men 20 years younger." Bree's smile wavered momentarily before snapping back into place. "Walter, denial is completely normal at your age, but we have to think about what happens when you can't manage anymore. What if you fall? What if there's an emergency?" The what-if game. I'd played it myself after Rose passed, lying awake at night wondering about all the terrible possibilities that might befall an old man living alone. But fear of what might happen was no reason to abandon what was happening now. "I appreciate your concern," I said, measuring each word carefully, "but I'm not ready to give up my home." David finally found his voice, though it came out strained and uncomfortable. "Dad, it's not just about being ready. The house is expensive to maintain. Property taxes, utilities, repairs. You're on a fixed income." Fixed income. Another phrase that made my jaw clench. My postal pension and Rose's life insurance had left us comfortable enough to maintain our modest lifestyle. We'd never been wealthy, but we'd been prudent, saving every extra dollar and paying off the mortgage early. "My finances are my business," I replied, perhaps more sharply than I intended. "This house has been paid for since 1998, and I can afford the upkeep." Bree leaned forward, her eyes brightening with what looked suspiciously like excitement. "But think about it logically, Walter. You're sitting on a valuable asset that's just going to require more and more expensive maintenance. The roof will need replacing soon, the furnace is getting old, and heaven knows what other surprises an old house might have." There it was. The real motivation hiding behind their concern for my well-being. My house, the two-story colonial that Rose and I had bought as newlyweds in 1976, had appreciated considerably over the decades. Cedar Falls had grown from a sleepy farming community to a thriving suburb, and properties on Oak Ridge Drive were now worth triple what we'd originally paid. "The house is in excellent condition," I said, my postal worker's pride in maintenance and organization flaring up. "I've kept detailed records of every repair and upgrade for 48 years. Bree waved her hand dismissively. "Written records don't tell the whole story about a house this age. There could be foundation issues, electrical problems, plumbing disasters waiting to happen. You'd never know until it's too late." Something in her tone set off alarm bells. This wasn't idle concern about hypothetical future problems. She spoke with the confidence of someone who'd already investigated possibilities, someone who'd done research. "Have you had the house inspected without telling me?" I asked directly, watching her face for tells like I used to watch for dogs on my mail route. "Of course not," she replied quickly, but her eyes shifted to David for just a moment. "We're just thinking ahead, trying to be responsible about everyone's future." Everyone's future. Not my future, but everyone's, including hers. David cleared his throat. "Dad, we found a really nice place at Sunset Village. 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and they handle all the maintenance. You could move your favorite furniture, keep your routines, but have help when you need it." "And what happens to this house?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Well," Bree said, her voice taking on a business-like tone, "selling it would provide funds for your care and leave something for David's future too. It's really the most sensible solution for everyone." There it was. The house sale, presented as sensible planning, but really about accessing my equity while I was still alive to authorize it. I'd seen this scenario play out during my mail route years. Families pressuring elderly relatives to liquidate assets under the guise of practical planning. "I'm not selling my house," I said with finality. "Rose and I built our life here. This is where I intend to stay." Bree's smile turned brittle around the edges. "Walter, sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for our own good, even when we don't want to." The condescending tone made my blood pressure spike. "Bree, I've been making my own decisions for 70 years. I think I can manage a few more without guidance." She stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt with sharp, angry movements. "Fine. But when something happens, don't expect us to drop everything to clean up the mess." After they left, I sat in the quiet living room, staring at the family photos on the mantelpiece.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rose smiled back at me from our wedding picture, young and hopeful, completely unaware that someday strangers would try to convince her husband to abandon the home they'd built together. Something wasn't right about this conversation. Bree's knowledge of house problems seemed too specific, too researched. Her confidence about my financial situation too assured. And David's nervous behavior suggested he knew more than he was saying. I walked to my basement workshop where Rose's rocking chair still sat beside my tool bench, exactly where I'd placed it after her funeral. This house held 48 years of memories, from David's first steps in the hallway to Rose's last Christmas morning in the kitchen. Nobody was taking it away from me without a fight. And if Bree thought she could manipulate an old poster worker who'd spent decades dealing with every kind of person imaginable, she was about to learn just how wrong she could be. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my mood as I sat at the kitchen table with my address book and a steaming cup of coffee. Sleep had been elusive after yesterday's confrontation, my mind churning through Bree's words and David's uncomfortable silence. Something about their visit felt orchestrated, rehearsed even, like they'd practiced their arguments beforehand. I flipped through the worn pages of my address book, a relic from my postal days when knowing everyone in town was part of the job. After 35 years of delivering mail to every doorstep in Cedar Falls, I'd built relationships with half the community. If Bree had been asking questions about my house or my finances, someone would have heard about it. My first call went to Martha Henderson at City Hall, where I'd delivered mail for 15 years before her retirement. Martha had worked in the building permits office and knew every contractor, inspector, and handyman in 3 counties. "Walter Thompson, as I live and breathe," Martha's voice crackled through the receiver. "How you holding up, dear? I still think about Rose every time I pass your street." "I'm doing well, Martha. Thank you for asking. I was wondering if you might help me with something. Has anyone been asking questions about my house lately? Maybe requesting inspection records or permits?" A pause stretched across the line, long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Then Martha's voice returned, quieter and more careful. "Funny you should ask. About 3 weeks ago, a young woman came in asking about properties on Oak Ridge Drive. Said she was doing research for a real estate investment group. Pretty thing, blonde hair, very polished." My grip tightened on the phone. "Did she give a name?" "Called herself Brianna Mitchell. Asked specifically about houses built in the 70s. Wanted to know about foundation issues, electrical updates, that sort of thing. I told her most of those homes were solid construction, but she seemed particularly interested in any problems we might have on file." Brianna Mitchell. Bree's full name, which she rarely used. My daughter-in-law had been researching my house weeks before yesterday's surprise visit, gathering ammunition for arguments I hadn't even known were coming. "Did she ask about my property specifically?" Martha hesitated again. "She had a list of addresses. Yours was on it, along with 4 or 5 others on your street. Said they were looking for properties with potential issues that might make good investment opportunities." Investment opportunities. The phrase sent ice water through my veins. Bree hadn't been conducting idle research about old houses. She'd been hunting for problems she could use to justify forcing a sale. "Martha, I need to ask you something important. Are there any actual problems with my house on file? Any violations or inspection issues?" "Walter, honey, your property file is cleaner than most houses built last year. You've kept up with every permit, every upgrade. The only thing in there is your kitchen renovation from 2018 and that roof repair after the storm in 2020. Both passed inspection with flying colors." Bree's concern about my house wasn't based on actual knowledge of problems. She'd been fishing for issues that didn't exist, hoping to find leverage she could use against me. My second call went to Ernie Kowalski next door, a retired mechanic with sharp eyes and a suspicious nature honed by years of dealing with customers trying to avoid paying for repairs. "Ernie, it's Walt. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Shoot, neighbor, what's on your mind?" "Have you noticed anyone hanging around my house when I wasn't home, maybe taking pictures or walking around the property?" Ernie's grunt carried the weight of confirmation. "Matter of fact, I did. Last Tuesday morning, while you were at the grocery store, that daughter-in-law of yours brought some fellow with her. He had one of those clipboards and was taking notes, walking all around your foundation. My blood turned to slush. What did this man look like? Tall, thin, maybe 40 years old, drove a white pickup with Garrett Home Inspections painted on the side. They were out there for about an hour, him pointing at things and her writing it all down. Steve Garrett. I knew that name from somewhere, but couldn't immediately place it. Did you talk to them? Tried to, but your daughter-in-law said they were just doing a routine inspection for insurance purposes. Seemed odd to me, you not mentioning anything about it, but I figured it wasn't my business. After ending the call, I pulled out the Cedar Falls phone directory and searched for Garrett Home Inspections. No listing. I tried the Yellow Pages online, then the Better Business Bureau website. Steve Garrett's inspection company didn't seem to exist anywhere except on the side of his truck. A fake inspector examining my house while I was away, taking notes and looking for problems that could be used against me. The picture was becoming clearer, and it painted Bree in a light that made my stomach churn. I spent the afternoon at the Cedar Falls Public Library, using their computers to research property transfer laws and elder fraud tactics. What I discovered made my hands shake as I printed page after page of information. Unscrupulous family members often used manufactured housing emergencies to pressure elderly relatives into quick sales or transfers, create a crisis, offer a solution, and benefit from the panic. The library's database of local business licenses confirmed what I'd suspected. Steve Garrett had been licensed as a home inspector for exactly 6 months, right around the time David and Bree got married. Before that, no record of him anywhere in Iowa. By closing time, I had a folder full of evidence that Bree's sudden concern about my living situation wasn't concern at all. It was the opening move in a carefully planned campaign to separate me from my house. But I had one more stop to make before heading home. Helen Patel's law office sat above Murphy's Diner on Main Street, in a building where I'd delivered mail every day for 2 decades. Helen had handled Rose's estate after her passing, and I trusted her judgment completely. "Walter, this is an unexpected pleasure," Helen said as I climbed the narrow stairs to her office. "What brings you by so late in the day?" I spread my research across her desk, explaining Bree's visit, Martha's information about the bogus real estate inquiry, and Ernie's account of the fake inspection. Helen listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. "Walter, what you're describing sounds like the beginning of a systematic attempt to manipulate you into selling your property," she said finally. "I've seen similar cases, usually involving family members who feel entitled to elderly relatives' assets. What can I do about it?" Helen picked up the printout about Steve Garrett's suspicious licensing history. "First, we document everything, every conversation, every visit, every attempt to pressure you. Second, we verify the legitimacy of anyone claiming to have inspected your property." She pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. "I'm going to contact the state licensing board about Mr. Garrett's credentials. If he's operating without proper certification or providing false reports, that's fraud. As for Bree's activities at City Hall, that's more complicated, but the pattern of deception is clear. Should I confront them directly? Not yet. If this is as calculated as it appears, confronting them now will only make them more careful. Let them think their plan is working while we gather more evidence." Helen walked me to the door as her office grew dark around us. "Walter, I want you to be very careful over the next few weeks. People who go to these lengths to manipulate property transfers don't usually stop when their first attempt fails." Driving home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls, I thought about Helen's warning. Bree had invested weeks of research and planning into this scheme. Yesterday's conversation hadn't been a spontaneous suggestion about my living arrangements. It had been the opening salvo in a campaign she'd been preparing for months. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated a postal worker who'd spent 35 years paying attention to details, building relationships, and spotting trouble before it arrived at the front door. Back home, I sat in Rose's rocking chair in my workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had filled my retirement years. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that spoke of home and history and belonging. Bree wanted to turn my sanctuary into a real estate transaction, my memories into market value. She saw an old man alone in a big house, ripe for manipulation and pressure. What she didn't see was a man who'd built a lifetime of connections, who understood the difference between genuine concern and calculated greed, and who had no intention of abandoning the home where he'd promised Rose he'd live out his days. Tomorrow, I'd start making more calls, gathering more evidence, building the case that would expose Bree's true motives. If he wanted a fight over my house, she was about to discover she'd picked the wrong opponent. The week following my discovery of Bree's deception passed in a blur of phone calls and careful investigation. Each conversation revealed another piece of her elaborate scheme, painting a picture that grew more disturbing by the day. What had started as suspicion was crystallizing into certainty that my daughter-in-law was orchestrating a sophisticated fraud. Thursday afternoon brought the call I'd been dreading. David's voice sounded strained when he asked if he could stop by after work, alone this time. I agreed, though my stomach twisted with anticipation of another confrontation. He arrived at 6 sharp, still wearing his insurance adjuster uniform, looking older than his 36 years. The man who'd once filled this house with laughter as a boy now carried himself with the weight of adult complications I'd hoped he'd never face. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, settling heavily into the couch where he'd spent countless Saturday mornings watching cartoons with his own children before the divorce. "I'm listening," I replied, though every instinct told me to brace for impact. David ran his hands through his thinning hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of myself at his age when work stress kept me awake at night. Bree showed me the inspection report on the house. "Dad, there are serious problems you need to know about." My blood chilled, though I'd been expecting this moment since my conversation with Ernie. "What kind of problems?" He pulled the manila folder from his briefcase, spreading official-looking documents across my coffee table. Foundation settling, electrical code violations, potential water damage in the basement. The inspector says the house could be dangerous. I studied the papers with the same attention I'd once given to sorting mail by routes and delivery times. The letterhead read, "Garrett Professional Home Inspection Services," with an address in West Des Moines. Steve Garrett's signature scrawled across the bottom of each page, accompanied by an official-looking seal. "David, when was this inspection done?"
"Last week while you were at your doctor's appointment. Bree arranged it through her real estate contact. She was worried about you living here, so she had it checked out." "While I was at my doctor's appointment?" The same appointment Bree had asked about the day before, claiming she wanted to make sure I was staying healthy? She'd used my medical schedule to gain access to my property without my knowledge or consent? "Did you authorize this inspection?" I asked, keeping my voice calm despite the fury building in my chest. David shifted uncomfortably. "We thought it would be better to get the facts first, then discuss them with you. We didn't want to worry you unnecessarily if everything was fine." The condescension in his explanation cut deeper than any outright hostility. My own son had participated in having my home inspected behind my back, treating me like a child incapable of making informed decisions about my own property. What exactly does this report claim is wrong? David pointed to highlighted sections throughout the document. Hairline cracks in the foundation that could indicate settling, aluminum wiring in some circuits that doesn't meet current code, water stains in the basement ceiling that suggest plumbing leaks above. Each accusation struck me as deliberately vague, the kind of issues that could be found in virtually any house built in the 1970s. But presented together in official language, they painted a picture of a home teetering on the edge of catastrophic failure. The inspector recommends immediate professional evaluation and possibly relocating until repairs can be completed, David continued. Dad, we can't ignore this. What if something happens? I stood and walked to my basement door, flipping on the lights that illuminated my workshop below. David, come down here with me. We descended the wooden stairs I'd rebuilt myself 15 years ago, our footsteps echoing in the familiar space where I'd spent countless hours building furniture and fixing household problems. The basement smelled of sawdust and machine oil, honest scents that spoke of productive work and careful maintenance. Show me these water stains, I said, pointing to the ceiling above my workbench. David consulted the report, then looked up at the exposed joists and plumbing lines. The report says they're right here, above your tool area. I switched on the bright work lights I'd installed for detailed projects, flooding the ceiling with clear illumination. The wood above us was clean and dry, showing no signs of water damage past or present. The copper pipes I'd had updated in 2015 gleamed without a trace of corrosion or leaks. David, do you see any water damage up there? He studied the ceiling carefully, his expression growing troubled. No, I don't see anything. We moved to the foundation walls where the report claimed to have identified dangerous settling cracks. The concrete I'd sealed and painted 5 years ago showed no structural problems, just the normal minor settling lines that appeared in virtually every basement in Iowa. What about the electrical issues? David asked, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. I led him to the electrical panel I'd had upgraded to modern circuit breakers in 2010. Every connection was clean and properly labeled. The work done by Tommy Morrison, the best electrician in Cedar Falls. The aluminum wiring mentioned in the report existed only in the inspector's imagination. David, this house has been maintained better than most properties half its age. I have receipts for every repair, permits for every upgrade, and warranties on every major system. My son stared at the inspection report in his hands, seeing it with new eyes. The confident certainty he'd carried into the house was cracking like ice on a spring pond. But the inspector took photos, made measurements. This all seemed so... Professional fraud often does, I said gently. Son, I need to tell you something about your wife's activities over the past month. Back upstairs, I spread my own documentation across the kitchen table.
Martha Henderson's account of Bree's research at City Hall, Ernie's eyewitness testimony about the fake inspection, Helen Patel's legal analysis of the manipulation tactics, and the business license records showing Steve Garrett's suspicious history. David read through each piece of evidence with growing horror, his face paling as the scope of his wife's deception became clear. She told me she was worried about you living alone, that the inspection was for your safety. David, your wife researched my property for weeks before that Sunday visit. She brought a fake inspector to my house while I was away, then presented you with falsified reports to convince you I was in danger. He slumped in his chair, the inspection report falling from his nerveless fingers. Why would she do this? What does she gain? The question hung between us like smoke from a house fire. David had married Bree 18 months ago, a whirlwind courtship that had surprised everyone with its speed. She'd been charming and attentive, winning over our small family with enthusiasm and apparent devotion. I've been researching similar cases, I said carefully. Sometimes people target elderly property owners through family connections, using manufactured crises to pressure quick sales or transfers. David's face went white. You think she married me to get access to your house?
The possibility that his marriage was part of an elaborate real estate fraud was devastating to consider, but the evidence pointed in that direction. Bree's timeline, her research, her manufactured emergency all suggested planning that predated her relationship with David. I don't know her true motivations, I admitted, but I know she's been systematically laying groundwork to convince us both that I can't safely live here anymore. My son sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of his wife's betrayal. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" "We gather more evidence," I said, "and we find out exactly how deep this goes." David looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of the frightened boy who'd once run to me when neighborhood bullies threatened him. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have talked to you before agreeing to any inspection." "You trusted your wife," I replied. "That's what married people are supposed to do. The problem isn't your trust, it's her abuse of it." That night, after David left with promises to pay closer attention to Bree's activities, I sat in my workshop holding the fraudulent inspection report. The document was sophisticated enough to fool someone who wanted to believe it, complete with technical jargon and official seals. But it was built on lies, just like the marriage that had brought it into our family. Bree had made one critical error in her planning. She'd assumed that an elderly widower would be isolated and vulnerable, easy to manipulate through manufactured fear. Instead, she'd targeted someone with decades of community connections and the investigative skills to expose her fraud. Tomorrow, I'd make more calls, gather more evidence, and continue building the case that would protect not just my property, but my son's future. Because Bree's scheme wasn't just about stealing my house, it was about destroying my family in the process. Friday morning brought unexpected urgency when Helen Patel called at 7:30, her voice tight with professional concern. The state licensing board had completed their investigation of Steve Garrett overnight, and the results were more damaging than either of us had anticipated. "Walter, you need to get down here immediately," Helen said. "Garrett isn't just operating with questionable credentials. He's wanted by authorities in 3 states for inspection fraud targeting elderly homeowners." I dressed quickly and drove through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls as the sun painted the sky orange above the cornfields. Helen's office building cast long shadows across Main Street, but her lights were already blazing in the second-floor windows. The Iowa Department of Professional Regulation flagged Garrett's license application the moment I submitted our inquiry, Helen explained, spreading official documents across her conference table. His credentials were forged, his references were fake, and his business address doesn't exist. The paperwork painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise. Steve Garrett, whose real name was Stephen Garrett Williams, had been arrested twice in Missouri for elder fraud and once in Kansas for operating without proper licensing. Each case involved manufactured housing emergencies used to pressure elderly property owners into unnecessary repairs or quick sales. "There's more," Helen continued, pulling out a thick folder. "Detective Bob Williams from the Cedar Falls Police Department ran background checks on both Garrett and your daughter-in-law at my request. What they found explains a lot about her sudden interest in your property." Brianna Mitchell's financial records showed a pattern of escalating debt over the past 18 months. Credit card balances totaling nearly $40,000, 3 missed mortgage payments on her rental house, and a personal loan from a payday lender at usurious interest rates. She was drowning in obligations she couldn't meet on her kindergarten teacher's salary. "Helen, are you saying she married David for access to my house?" "I'm saying the timeline suggests planning. Her debt problems started accumulating right around the time she began dating your son. The wedding expenses alone pushed her deeper into financial trouble, but a successful property transfer would solve all her problems." Detective Williams arrived at Helen's office as she was explaining the legal implications. A stocky man in his 50s with the weathered look of someone who'd seen enough human deception to last several lifetimes. He shook my hand with genuine sympathy. "Mr. Thompson, I've been investigating elder fraud for 15 years, and this case has all the hallmarks of a sophisticated operation," he said, settling into Helen's client chair. "Your daughter-in-law's connection to Garrett wasn't accidental. They've worked together before." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Detective Williams opened his briefcase and pulled out surveillance photos showing Bree and Garrett together at a Des Moines restaurant, clearly comfortable with each other in a way that suggested prior acquaintance. These were taken 3 months ago by Missouri authorities tracking Garrett's activities. They've been building a case against him for interstate fraud, but couldn't locate him until your lawyer's inquiry led us to Cedar Falls. Helen leaned forward across her desk. "Walter, this means Bree's entire relationship with your family was likely planned from the beginning. She identified you as a target, researched your background, then positioned herself to gain access through David." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every moment when I'd welcomed Bree into our home had been part of an elaborate deception designed to separate me from my property. "What about David?" I asked. "Does he know about any of this?" Detective Williams consulted his notes. "Our investigation suggests your son is an unwitting victim. His financial records show no unusual activity, and his employment history indicates he's exactly who he appears to be. She used him to get close to you." "We need to be very careful how we proceed," Helen warned. "If Bree suspects we're onto her scheme, she might accelerate her timeline or try to manipulate David into acting against your interests." Detective Williams nodded agreement. "We need her to make the next move while we're recording everything for evidence. Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to wear a wire during your next conversation with her?" The idea of secretly recording my daughter-in-law felt like crossing a line I'd never imagined approaching. But the alternative was allowing her to continue manipulating my son while working to steal my home. What exactly would I need to do? "Act confused and concerned about the inspection report," Detective Williams explained. "Let her think her plan is working. Ask questions about selling the house, about moving to assisted living.
Get her to explain her reasoning on tape." Helen pulled out legal documents she'd prepared in advance. "I've also drafted protective paperwork, power of attorney restrictions, property transfer prohibitions, and financial account alerts. If Bree tries to forge your signature or manipulate David into authorizing transactions, we'll have immediate legal recourse." Signing the protective orders felt like putting on armor before a battle I'd never wanted to fight. Each signature was a recognition that my own family had become a battlefield where trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. "There's one more thing," Detective Williams said as we prepared to leave Helen's office. "We've been in contact with Missouri and Kansas authorities. If we can get Bree on tape admitting to fraud or conspiracy, the charges will be federal. She's looking at significant prison time." The drive home took me past familiar landmarks that suddenly seemed ominous in the morning light. Murphy's Diner, where Rose and I had shared countless meals. The post office, where I'd started each workday for 35 years. The library, where I'd researched Bree's deception just days ago. My quiet hometown had become the setting for a criminal investigation. At home, I found David's car in my driveway, and my son pacing anxiously in the living room. His face showed the strain of a man caught between loyalty to his wife and growing suspicions about her motives. "Dad, Bree wants to meet with us this afternoon about the housing situation. She says she's found a perfect assisted living facility and wants to show you the brochures." The timing was eerily perfect. Bree was ready to make her next move, probably expecting David's support based on the fraudulent inspection report. She had no idea we'd already exposed her entire operation. "What did you tell her?"
I said I'd check with you first, David replied, his voice carrying exhaustion that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult realizations. Dad, I keep thinking about what you showed me yesterday. The more I consider it, the more questions I have about Bree's behavior. David sat heavily on Rose's old couch, looking like a man who discovered his marriage was built on lies. She's been asking a lot of questions about your finances lately. Investment accounts, insurance policies, estate planning. I thought she was just trying to help with family planning, but now you're wondering if she had other motives. He nodded miserably. She also keeps talking about how much the house is worth, how it's too much property for one person, how we could all benefit from a sale. I thought she was being practical, but maybe she was being calculating. I sat across from my son, weighing how much to tell him about the morning's discoveries. The protective father in me wanted to shield him from the full scope of Bree's betrayal, but the practical man knew he needed to understand what we were facing. David, I met with Helen Patel and the police this morning. We've learned some things about Bree that you need to know. His face went pale as I explained the debt problems, the connection to Steve Garrett, and the likelihood that her entire relationship with our family was fraudulent from the beginning. Each revelation hit him like a physical blow, and I watched my son's world crumble in real time. "She never loved me at all," he whispered when I finished. "I was just a way to get to your house." "We don't know that for certain," I said gently, though Detective Williams's evidence suggested exactly that conclusion. "But we do know she's been lying about her intentions and her associations." David stared at his hands, wedding ring catching the afternoon light streaming through Rose's lace curtains. "What happens now?" "Now we give her enough rope to hang herself," I said, using an expression my own father had favored. "The police want me to wear a recording device during our meeting this afternoon. If she admits to fraud or conspiracy, they'll have enough evidence to arrest her." My son looked up at me with eyes that seemed decades older than they'd been a week ago. "I can't believe I brought this into our family. Mom would be ashamed of me." "Your mother would be proud of how you're handling a terrible situation," I corrected. "Rose always said that character isn't about avoiding mistakes, it's about what you do when you discover them." As we waited for Bree's afternoon visit, I thought about the recording equipment Detective Williams would install before she arrived. In a few hours, my living room would become a crime scene, and my daughter-in-law would unknowingly provide the evidence that would send her to federal prison. The house that Bree wanted to steal would become the trap that caught her. Detective Williams finished adjusting the tiny recording device hidden beneath my flannel shirt just as Bree's car pulled into the driveway. The wire felt cold against my skin, a constant reminder that the next hour would determine whether justice prevailed or my daughter-in-law succeeded in her elaborate fraud. "Remember, act concerned about the inspection report," Detective Williams whispered as he packed his equipment into a toolbox disguised as home repair supplies. "Let her explain her solutions. The more she talks, the more evidence we gather." David sat rigid in the kitchen, his wedding ring spinning nervously around his finger as he watched his wife approach the front door. The man who defended Bree just days ago now looked at her with the haunted expression of someone seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. Bree entered with her usual confident smile, carrying a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained more manufactured evidence of my housing crisis. She wore a navy business suit that made her look official and trustworthy, the perfect costume for convincing an elderly man to abandon his home. "Walter, I'm so glad you agreed to meet," she said, settling into Rose's chair with proprietorial ease. "David told me you've been worried about the inspection report." "It's certainly concerning," I replied, playing my role as confused elderly victim. "All those problems with the foundation and electrical system. I had no idea things were so bad." Bree's eyes lit up with barely concealed satisfaction. These old houses hide their problems well, but eventually everything catches up. The important thing is that we caught these issues before something catastrophic happened. She opened her portfolio and spread glossy brochures across my coffee table. Sunset Village Assisted Living smiled back at me from professional photographs showing elderly residents playing cards and tending gardens under the watchful eyes of uniformed staff. I've already spoken with the admissions director, Bree continued smoothly. They have a beautiful two-bedroom unit available immediately. Full kitchen, private bathroom, and 24-hour medical support. What about my house? I asked, though I already knew her answer. Well, with all these structural problems, the safest thing would be to sell quickly before the issues get worse. I've contacted a real estate investor who specializes in properties that need major renovations. There it was, the heart of her scheme laid bare for the recording device. Quick sale to an investor, probably at below market price, with Bree collecting a finder's fee or outright kickback for delivering the property. David cleared his throat from the kitchen doorway. Bree, what about getting a second opinion on the inspection? Maybe the problems aren't as serious as they seem. His wife's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing irritation at his unexpected resistance. David, we can't take chances with your father's safety. Besides, I've already verified the inspector's credentials. Steve Garrett is highly recommended. Recommended by whom? I asked innocently. My real estate contact in Des Moines. She uses him for all her property evaluations. Bree's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd rehearsed this explanation. He's licensed, bonded, and has an excellent reputation. The lies flowed so smoothly I almost admired her skill. If I hadn't already discovered Steve Garrett's criminal history, her deception would have been completely convincing. This is all happening so fast, I said, maintaining my confused elderly act. Maybe I should talk to my lawyer before making any decisions. Bree leaned forward, her voice taking on urgent tones. Walter, lawyers just complicate these situations with unnecessary delays. The assisted living unit won't wait forever, and the real estate investor is only interested if we can close quickly. How quickly are we talking about? Ideally, we'd have you moved out by the end of next week. That gives us time to handle the paperwork and transfer arrangements. Next week? The timeline revealed just how urgent her financial situation had become. $40,000 in debt with creditors closing in, and she needed my house sale to happen immediately. What happens to the money from the sale? David asked, his voice carefully neutral. After paying off the mortgage and covering moving expenses, the remainder would go into a trust account for Walter's care, Bree explained with practiced smoothness. I'd be happy to help manage those funds to ensure they're used appropriately. She'd be happy to manage my money. The final piece of her scheme clicked into place. Not only did she want to force the sale of my property, she intended to control the proceeds as well. That's very generous of you, I said, fighting to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. But I should mention something. I called the city about the inspection report, just to verify the violations. Bree's smile froze. Oh? What did they say? Interesting thing. They have no record of any violations or problems with this property. In fact, my file shows all systems are up to code and properly maintained. The silence stretched like a wire under tension. Bree's face cycled through confusion, calculation, and barely controlled panic before settling on injured innocence. That must be an administrative error, she said quickly. Government offices are notoriously behind on their paperwork. I also called Steve Garrett's business number, I continued relentlessly. Strange thing, the number's been disconnected, and his business address doesn't exist. Bree stood abruptly, her portfolio scattering brochures across the floor. Walter, you're obviously confused about these details. Age sometimes makes people suspicious of help when they need it most. I'm not confused about fraud, I said, dropping all pretense. I know about your debts, your connection to Steve Garrett, and your research at City Hall months before you claimed to be worried about my safety. Her mask finally shattered completely. You have no idea what you're talking about, old man. This house is falling apart, and yet too stubborn to admit it. The only thing falling apart is your scheme, David said from the doorway, his voice heavy with disgust. I've seen the evidence, Bree. The fake inspection, the forged business licenses, your financial records. It's over. Bree spun toward her husband with desperation, replacing calculation. David, you can't believe these paranoid delusions. I'm trying to help your father before he gets hurt. By stealing his house? David's voice carried the pain of ultimate betrayal. By lying to both of us for months? By marrying me to get access to his property? That's not... I never... Bree's composure cracked entirely. Fine, yes, the house is worth good money, and he's wasting it living here alone. We could all benefit from a sale. There's nothing criminal about practical planning. The recording device captured every word of her admission. Detective Williams would have everything he needed for federal fraud charges. Actually, there is something criminal about forged inspection reports and fraudulent business licenses, Detective Williams announced, stepping through my front door with 2 uniformed officers. Brianna Mitchell, you're under arrest for elder fraud, conspiracy, and interstate racketeering. Bree's face went white as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. This is ridiculous. I was helping family. You can't prove I did anything wrong. We can prove everything, Detective Williams replied, holding up the recording device.
Including your admission that you planned to benefit financially from fraudulent property transfer. As they led Bree toward the police car, she turned back to David with desperate eyes. You can't let them do this to me. We're married. We're supposed to be partners. David watched his wife being arrested with the hollow expression of a man whose entire world had been revealed as fiction. Partners don't lie to each other, Bree. Partners don't commit crimes against family. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse as Judge Sarah Martinez sentenced Brianna Mitchell to 4 years in federal prison for elder fraud and conspiracy. Steve Garrett received 7 years as a repeat offender. The courtroom was packed with other victims whose families had been torn apart by similar schemes. David filed for divorce the day after Bree's arrest and moved back into his childhood bedroom while he rebuilt his life. We spent evenings in my workshop where he learned to use Rose's old sewing machine to repair the trust that had been damaged by his wife's betrayal. My house remained exactly where it belonged, filled with memories of family dinners and holiday celebrations, protected by the connections I'd built over a lifetime of honest work and community service. Bree had seen an isolated, elderly target ripe for manipulation. Instead, she'd found a man surrounded by friends, armed with knowledge, and determined to protect what mattered most. Sometimes the best defense against those who would exploit our vulnerabilities is simply refusing to be vulnerable in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.